I walked into an office of bullies. I didn't burn it down, I just stopped holding it up. My name is Tasha. I'm 28 years old. I was the last one hired on the team, which in an office like ours turns out to matter more than anything on your resume. By the time I came on board, Jenny, Allison, and Mandy had already been working together for 3 years, had already formed the particular density of friendship that forms among people who lunch together every day and cover for each other's mistakes and know things about each other's marriages that no HR handbook anticipates. I walked into that already set arrangement the way you walk into a room where furniture has been placed for people who aren't you. Technically, there was space. Functionally, I was always going to be the thing standing in the wrong spot. Jenny had married the pastor's son and could quote scripture the way some people quote sports statistics, fluently and with the quiet expectation that you'd be impressed. What she'd apparently missed, somewhere between Sunday service and Monday morning, was the part where kindness was supposed to come bundled with the quoting. Allison was the pretty one, and she'd built an entire operating philosophy around that fact. The philosophy being that consequences were things that happened to other people. Mandy was neither cruel nor kind, just soft in the specific way of someone who has learned that agreeing with the room is easier than being in the room alone. She never started anything. She also never stopped anything, which I would come to understand was its own kind of choice. Our supervisor, Bernadette, ran the team with the studied obliviousness of a woman who has decided that noticing problems obligates her to solve them, and has therefore made not noticing into a professional skill. She never once in my first 6 months acknowledged that anything strange was happening in that office. I don't think this was because she was stupid. I think it was because she had done the math on what confronting 3 tenured, tightly bonded women would cost her personally, weighed it against what ignoring a slightly uncomfortable new hire would cost her, and made a rational, self-interested decision that happened to be corrosive to everyone downstream of it. I had a master's degree. None of them did. I had actually traveled, backpacked through places whose names they'd only half recognize, sat in courtyards in cities they would never visit because their lives didn't have room in them for that kind of unaccounted-for time. They had husbands and children and mortgages, and the specific gravity that comes from being needed by small, demanding people every hour of every day. I want to be careful here because it would be easy to make this sound like envy explains everything, and I don't think envy alone explains anything. But I noticed early on that when I told them about a trip I'd taken, a month in Peru, say, or 2 weeks doing nothing in particular in Lisbon, there would be a pause, and then a small cutting remark, delivered lightly enough that objecting to it would have made me the problem. "Must be nice," Allison said once, not looking up from her monitor, "not having anyone who needs you." I said something about how travel wasn't really about needing or not needing anyone, it was just something I liked to do with my time and my money. She said, "Sure," in the tone of a woman closing a door she'd decided not to slam. Jenny added, without looking up either, that she personally couldn't imagine leaving her kids for that long, as though I'd asked her to imagine it, as though the question on the table had been about her kids at all. I stopped bringing up the trips. I kept a small brass elephant on my desk that I'd bought in a market outside Cusco, and after a while I noticed I'd angled it so it faced me and not the aisle. That was an early thing I did without deciding to do it, and later, looking back, I understood it as the first small surrender. You start by turning the thing you love to face only yourself. You don't realize yet that this is a rehearsal for turning everything that way. I want to be fair to them too, because it would be easy to write these 3 women as simple villains, and I don't think that's accurate. I heard things, in the months I sat near them, that weren't meant for me. Jenny, on the phone with her husband, her voice dropping into a register of exhaustion I recognized from my own mother years ago. "I asked you 3 times to pick him up, 3 times, David." And then, a beat later, brightening falsely for a client call as if the exhaustion had never existed. Allison talking to Mandy in the break room about a fight with her husband over money that had apparently gone on for 2 days. Mandy herself, quieter than either of them, once said something about how she couldn't remember the last time she'd had an uninterrupted hour that was just hers. I understood, hearing these things, that they were tired in a way I wasn't, weighed down by arrangements I hadn't made and didn't have to manage. I don't think that excuses what they did, but I think it's part of the truth of why they did it, and I'd rather tell the truth than a simpler, more satisfying story. The work itself, underneath all of this, was good work, the kind I'd trained for and believed in. We ran a program for a nonprofit that helped low-income single mothers pursue further education, helping them find the right program, helping fund it, and critically arranging childcare, because none of the rest of it means anything to a woman with 3 kids and no one to watch them while she's in a classroom. It had a lot of moving parts: enrollment deadlines, funding disbursements, childcare vouchers, check-ins to make sure nobody fell through a crack that the system had plenty of. It was meaningful work. It was also work that depended entirely on institutional memory, and it turned out our office had almost none because nobody had ever bothered to write anything down. I found this out the hard way, repeatedly, in my first month. I'd miss a step, not because I was careless, but because nobody had told me the step existed, and Bernadette, our supervisor, would come find me a few days later with a small, tired frown and say something like, "You didn't submit the childcare voucher renewal for the Alvarez file," and I would say, honestly, that I hadn't been told childcare vouchers needed quarterly renewal at all, and she would get a look on her face. I want to describe this look carefully because it became a kind of weather system I learned to read over the following year. A look that was equal parts confusion and the desire not to deal with the confusion. "Oh," she'd say, "that's Jenny's area, she should have shown you that." Or, "Mandy usually handles the walkthrough on that, strange she didn't." It was never anyone's fault in a way that required anyone to do anything. It was always a vague, floating, almost fault, attributed to whoever wasn't in the room, resolved by nothing at all. Once, early on, I asked Jenny directly whether there was a manual, a shared drive, anything. She looked at me like I'd asked something faintly embarrassing. "We just kind of know it," she said. "You'll pick it up." I said I understood that, but that picking it up seemed to mean I found out about each missing piece only after failing to do it, at which point it became a mark against me rather than a gap in training. She shrugged. "That's just how it works here." I would come to learn that "that's just how it works here" was a sentence deployed whenever someone wanted to protect an arrangement that benefited them without having to defend it on its merits. So I started keeping notes. Not petty notes, not gotcha notes. Actual detailed documentation. Every process, every step, every date I learned something and from whom, because I am the kind of person who protects herself with facts rather than feelings when facts are available. When Bernadette came to me a second time with a version of the same complaint, I pulled out my notebook and showed her exactly what I'd been taught and by whom and when, and said calmly that if it wasn't in here, I hadn't been told it. She looked at the notebook the way you look at a thing you didn't expect to exist. "You keep this for everything?" she asked. I said yes. She said, "That's good. That's really good, actually." And then nothing changed about how the office ran, because a compliment costs nothing and requires nothing, and Bernadette had made an entire management style out of things that cost nothing and required nothing. I want to be specific about the texture of that year, because the tendency in describing office cruelty is to make it sound bigger and more dramatic than it actually was in the room. It wasn't dramatic. It was small, constant, and completely deniable. It was Jenny greeting me warmly at 9 a.m. and then, at 9:45, in a voice she thought was too low for me to hear over my own keyboard, telling Allison that some people had a lot of free time to spend flying around the world instead of, and here she'd trail off, letting the implication finish the sentence for her. It was Allison forwarding me half of an email chain instead of the whole thing, so that I'd walk into a meeting a step behind and Bernadette would ask, mildly, why I hadn't read the full thread, and I'd have to explain again that I'd only received half of it, and Allison would say, with wide, apologetic eyes, "Oh no, I'm so sorry, I must have hit reply instead of reply all," and everyone in the room would accept this as a normal, forgivable accident, because accidents committed by people you like are always more forgivable than patterns noticed by people you don't. There was a rhythm to it that I only recognized in hindsight. Something small would happen, a half-forwarded email, a meeting I wasn't told had moved rooms, a joke made at my expense and then immediately reframed as a joke I was simply too sensitive to enjoy. I would raise it, calmly, factually, usually to Bernadette, occasionally directly to whoever had done it. There would be an apology, thin but present. "I'm so sorry, I didn't realize. That's totally my fault, I'll be better about it." And then, within a week or two, something slightly worse would happen, dressed in the same plausible deniability costume as the last thing, so that each individual incident remained small enough to seem unreasonable to escalate, even as the pattern underneath them thickened. I watched, over months, the particular expression Bernadette wore whenever I brought something to her. It started as confusion. Genuine, I think, in the earliest days, the confusion of someone who hadn't yet decided what kind of manager she wanted to be. By month 4 or 5, it had shifted into something closer to weariness, a kind of preemptive tiredness that showed up on her face the second I appeared in her doorway, as if she could already hear the sentence I hadn't said yet and was bracing against having to do anything about it. By month 7, the weariness had a thin varnish of irritation over it, directed, I noticed, not at the 3 women creating the problems, but at me, for continuing to notice them. It was as though my persistence in reporting the pattern had itself become the pattern she resented. "Are you sure that's what she meant?" she asked me once, after I described a comment Jenny had made about my world traveler schedule in a meeting where I'd asked for a single afternoon off. "Sometimes things come across differently than they're intended." "I'm not asking you to guess her intentions," I said. "I'm telling you what she said and the tone she said it in a room with 4 other people in it." "I'll talk to her," Bernadette said. She always said this. It was, I came to understand, a sentence designed to end a conversation rather than begin an action, a verbal receipt issued in place of a refund. She never talked to her. Or if she did, whatever she said produced no observable change, which from where I sat amounted to the same thing. Things stayed at that low simmer for a long while, long enough that I'd stopped expecting a boil and started treating the discomfort as simply the temperature of the room, something to be managed rather than solved, the way you learn to live with a draft in an old apartment instead of fixing the window. And then came the agency-wide meeting with the Broward County office. Their team had lost a long-time worker a few months earlier, and in the gap left behind, whole categories of institutional knowledge had simply evaporated. Nobody had written down which funders required which paperwork. Nobody knew which women had appointments coming due. Nobody had a system, because, like us, they'd run for years on memory and goodwill and the assumption that the people who knew things would always be there to keep knowing them. Their supervisor, a soft-spoken, visibly exhausted man named Richard, described the situation to the room in the tone of someone still finding new cracks in a foundation he'd thought was solid. He said they'd lost track of at least 4 women's enrollment statuses in the confusion, and that finding out which of those women needed follow-up before it became urgent had eaten his entire month. Bernadette, sitting beside me, said, almost offhandedly, the way you'd mention a fact you'd forgotten was notable, "Tasha's actually been keeping really thorough notes on our whole process. Might be worth having her come over once a week to help you all start documenting things properly." Richard's face changed. Real gratitude, unguarded, the kind that doesn't calculate what it costs to express. "That would be incredible," he said. "Genuinely. Do you have any idea how much time that would save us?" He looked at me directly. "Thank you. I mean that. Most people don't think about this stuff until it's already a crisis." I said something modest. I meant it modestly. I did not expect what happened next, though in retrospect I should have, because I had already spent 7 months learning the shape of this particular room. Jenny's face, across the table, did something very small and very specific, a tightening at the jaw, a flatness moving into her eyes, gone almost as soon as it arrived, replaced by a smile aimed at Richard that had nothing behind it. I'd start noticing that expression more over the following weeks. Not anger exactly, something colder and more administrative than anger, the look of someone recalculating a ledger. Allison's version of the same expression was quicker and more theatrical. A little laugh, a little eye roll toward Mandy, as if the whole idea of my notebook being useful to anyone was faintly absurd, and she was simply too polite to say so out loud. Mandy didn't do anything with her face at all. She looked at her hands. I was the new person. I was not supposed to be the one anyone praised in a room like that. And I was not liked, which meant in the particular arithmetic of that office that I was also not supposed to be acknowledged for anything ever by anyone, because acknowledgement was a resource and resources were not distributed to people outside the circle. They did not take it well. Let's be precise about what not well meant in practice, because, as I've learned from telling pieces of this story to people outside that office, the tendency is to imagine something loud. It was never loud. It got quieter and more surgical. In the 2 weeks after that meeting, small things sharpened. Jenny stopped saying good morning to me entirely, a silence so deliberate it was almost its own kind of speech. Allison started routing questions about my own program's clients through Bernadette, instead of asking me directly, as if I'd become someone whose competence needed a chaperone. Mandy, for her part, got quieter still, which I understood now, looking back, as the sound of someone watching a decision being made that she didn't have the nerve to object to out loud. The following week, Bernadette was out of the office for 2 days at a training, and while she was gone, an important message came in about one of the Women in Out program. Denise, a woman with 2 kids who was 6 weeks from finishing her associate's degree and had been fighting for a testing accommodation for a placement exam that would determine whether she could move into the RN program she'd been working toward for 2 years. The message came in on Jenny's line because Jenny handled that funder's correspondence. Jenny was supposed to pass it to me since I was covering Denise's file that week. She didn't. She said later, when I asked her directly, that she'd simply forgotten. Denise missed the exam. She missed the window to reschedule it before the semester deadline. It set her back an entire academic term. 6 more months of a life she'd been trying, with everything she had, to move past. I confronted Jenny in the break room, quietly, because I didn't want an audience for either of our reactions. "You had the message for 2 days," I said. "You knew I was covering her file." "I forgot," Jenny said. Her face did the taxonomy thing again, the tight jaw, the flat eyes, but this time there was something almost daring underneath it, an invitation for me to make more of this than she was willing to let it become. "I have a lot going on, Tasha. I'm not perfect." "This isn't about perfect," I said. "This is about a woman who's been working for 2 years to get somewhere, and she just lost 6 months of her life because a message sat on your desk." "Maybe you should double-check things yourself instead of relying on other people," she said, and walked out, and I stood there with the specific, useless anger of having been handed a problem that had already, structurally, become mine to absorb. I went to Bernadette. I told her exactly what happened, with dates, the way I always did. She looked tired in the particular way she looked tired whenever I brought her something true and inconvenient. "Are you sure it wasn't just a genuine mistake?" she asked. Jenny's usually pretty reliable. "It cost a woman her semester," I said. "I don't think the question is whether it was genuine. I think the question is what we do now so it doesn't happen to the next person." "I'll talk to her," Bernadette said. She talked to her. Nothing changed. Denise's case became, in our internal files, a processing delay, a phrase engineered to describe a harm without assigning it to anyone. I called Denise myself, off the clock, to explain what had happened and apologize on behalf of an office that wasn't going to apologize on its own behalf. She was gracious about it in a way that made it worse. "These things happen," she said. And I thought about how much unpaid grace women like Denise were always being asked to extend to systems that had failed them, and how little of that grace ever got returned. I want to say something about what I did with all of this in the weeks after, because I think it matters more than the incidents themselves. I did not escalate. I did not go over Bernadette's head, though I'd thought about it and knew, abstractly, that I could have. I told myself I was giving the situation room to resolve itself, that Bernadette might yet do the difficult, necessary thing, that Richard's gratitude and the Broward assignment might shift some invisible balance of power in my favor over time if I was patient enough to let it. I tested that theory for nearly 2 months. I kept documenting. I kept being pleasant in meetings. I kept waiting for the moment when the accumulated weight of everything written in my notebook would finally tip some internal scale of Bernadette's toward action. This was, I understand now, a version of the same bargain I'd watched myself make with the brass elephant on my desk, a small, private turning away that felt like patience, but was actually just a slower kind of retreat. Mandy quit in October. She gave 2 weeks' notice, worked them out quietly and competently, and on her last day, after she'd cleaned out her desk and said her polite goodbyes to Jenny and Allison, she sent me a text message. It was one of those disappearing messages, set to vanish after I'd read it, which told me she'd thought carefully about sending it, and equally carefully about making sure it could never be produced as evidence of anything, to anyone, ever. "I'm sorry about what we did," it said. "I tried to talk to Jenny about the message thing, but she wouldn't hear it. I'm leaving because I don't think any of this has been fair to you, and I don't want to be a part of it anymore." I read it twice before it disappeared. I didn't respond. There wasn't anything to say to a woman who'd found the exit, and on her way through it, allowed herself exactly one honest sentence, delivered in a format engineered to cost her nothing. Things fell apart faster than I expected once Mandy left. She had, it turned out, been the connective tissue of that office in ways nobody had mapped or acknowledged, quietly holding relationships with 3 different funders, remembering which women needed extra follow-up calls, catching things before they became crises. None of it was written down. None of it was mine to inherit, because nobody had cross-trained anyone on anything, ever, in the history of that program. Deadlines started slipping. Women started calling the main line, confused about paperwork nobody could locate. Bernadette tried to absorb the overflow herself, and within 2 weeks I watched her go from tired to genuinely overwhelmed, the earlier weariness curdling into something closer to panic, a woman realizing in real time that the machine she'd been quietly neglecting for years had no spare parts. I kept my notebook current. I kept doing my job well because the women in that program had never done anything to deserve worse service on account of an office culture that wasn't theirs to fix. But I noticed something in myself during those weeks that I want to be honest about. Underneath the professionalism, I had started, very deliberately, to imagine the door. I gave it longer than I probably should have. I told myself I was testing whether Mandy's absence would finally force Bernadette's hand, whether losing one person would be the thing that made her actually manage the other 2 workers who remained. It wasn't. Jenny and Allison, freed of the one person in their triangle who'd occasionally felt bad about things, became, if anything, lighter, easier with each other, unbothered. I watched them at lunch through the break room window one Tuesday, laughing at something, entirely unburdened by what their forgetting had cost Denise, by what their unkindness had cost Mandy, by what any of it had cost the office they were, in theory, supposed to be running competently. And I understood, watching that, with a clarity that didn't feel angry so much as simply final, that nothing here was going to change because I stayed in the room waiting for it to change. I quit 2 weeks after that, without notice. I know this wasn't professional of me, in the traditional sense, and I don't fully regret it. I had given that office a year of good, careful, well-documented work, and what it had given me back was a supervisor who treated every complaint as an inconvenience, and 2 coworkers who treated my competence as an insult. I didn't owe them the standard 2 weeks of unpaid emotional labor on my way out the door. Bernadette called the day after I left, then again 2 days after that. Then, when I didn't pick up, she emailed, and when I didn't answer the email, she had HR email asking, with a formality that arrived about 8 months too late to mean anything, whether I might be willing to hand over any documentation or process notes I'd kept during my employment, for continuity purposes. I want to sit with that request for a second because it tells you something true about how that entire year had actually worked. My notebook, the thing I had built alone, on my own time, in my own handwriting, specifically because nobody in that office would do the job of documenting anything themselves, was legally and practically mine. It was not agency property. It had never been treated as agency property while I was there. It had been treated as an oddity, a private habit, occasionally useful when it embarrassed someone into silence, never once formally adopted or requested or backed by an institutional policy that might have made it belong to anyone but me. Bernadette had had a full year to ask that my notes be copied, standardized, and folded into a shared system. She hadn't, because doing that would have required her to admit out loud that the entire office ran on the private, unpaid initiative of one person she didn't especially like. I didn't send the notebook. I told HR, politely, that my personal notes had been a private tool I'd used to protect myself given the office's lack of documented processes, and that I didn't feel obligated to hand over materials I'd created on my own initiative to compensate for a system that had never been built. I don't know if that was generous or petty. I've turned it over enough times since then to know it was probably both, in roughly equal measure, and that I'm at peace with that ratio. I heard secondhand, months later, through someone still in the nonprofit world, how it ended. The office missed enough deadlines, lost track of enough women, mishandled enough funder relationships that the agency folded our division entirely into the Broward County office. The same office Richard ran, the same office I'd been asked, once, to help. Bernadette was let go. Jenny and Allison were kept on, technically, but placed on a formal performance plan, monitored closely enough that I imagine the low-simmer cruelty they'd specialized in became a good deal harder to practice under supervision that actually paid attention. I did not feel triumphant when I heard this. I want to say that clearly, because the version of this story that would be easiest to tell is the one where I hear the ending and feel something clean and satisfying. The mean girls finally caught. The negligent manager finally held to account. Credits roll. That isn't quite what I felt. What I felt was something more complicated, a kind of grim, unhappy vindication tangled up with real sorrow for Denise, whose semester nobody gave back to her, and for the women still in that program who'd had to live through months of missed calls and lost paperwork, while 3 grown adults sorted out whose fault it was that nobody had ever written anything down. I don't mourn Jenny or Allison's discomfort. I don't mourn Bernadette's job, not really, though I recognize she was a person too, managing a job she was in some ways as unequipped for as I'd once assumed she was avoiding. What I mourn, if I mourn anything from that year, is the year itself, the version of the work I'd wanted to do, that I never got to have. What I learned, and it's a smaller, plainer lesson than the story maybe deserves, is this. When you notice, early and clearly, that the people meant to manage a bad dynamic have no intention of managing it, the smart thing isn't to out-document, outperform, or out-patience your way into being valued. Competence doesn't convert into safety in a room where safety was never the currency being traded. I could have kept better notes than anyone in that building's history, and it would not have mattered, because the problem was never a lack of information. Bernadette had all the information she needed, in writing, dated from the first month I worked there. She simply never intended to use it. I think about that a lot now, more than I expected to. Not the 3 of them specifically. I've mostly stopped thinking about Jenny's face or Allison's laugh, or even Mandy's one honest sentence disappearing off my phone screen. What I think about is myself, the version of me who sat in that office for a year believing that if I just did the work well enough, thoroughly enough, patiently enough, someone would eventually have to notice and do right by me. I was raised, I think, to believe that diligence was a kind of insurance policy. Work hard, keep records, be the reasonable one in the room, and eventually the room rearranges itself around your reasonableness. I don't believe that anymore, not in the uncomplicated way I used to. I believe effort is worth something to the person doing it, for its own sake, but I no longer believe it's owed a return from people who were never planning on paying it. That's changed how I move through my new job, in ways I notice mostly in small moments. I still keep notes. I'll probably always keep notes, it's just how my mind organizes a job it takes seriously. But I don't keep them anymore as evidence I'm quietly building in case I need to defend myself someday. I keep them because they're useful, and the difference between those 2 reasons turns out to matter enormously, even if it doesn't change a single word written on the page. I've also gotten faster at reading a room. In my first month here, a coworker made one of those small, testing remarks. Something about how nice it must be to have so much free time, and I didn't let it sit for 8 months to see where it led. I said evenly, "I'm not sure what you mean by that," and watched her decide on the spot that I wasn't going to be an easy target. That's a skill I didn't have a year ago. I paid for it, the way you pay for most skills that turn out to matter, in a currency I wouldn't choose to spend again if I had the option. I don't know yet what this job will become, or these coworkers, or whether I'll be here in 5 years or 5 months. What I do know is that I'm watching differently than I used to. Not with suspicion exactly, but with a kind of attention I didn't used to think I needed. I'm watching for whether the person managing this room intends to manage it, or whether she's just hoping, the way Bernadette hoped, that nothing will ever cost enough to require her to. I think that's the actual inheritance from that year. Not bitterness, though I have some left over, and not triumph, though I understand why the story might want one. Just a sharper eye, and a shorter patience, and a private understanding that the two of those together are probably what protecting myself is going to look like from now on. Nobody here has said a single snide thing about the places I've been, and I notice some mornings that I'm still faintly surprised by that. The way you're surprised by ordinary kindness after a long stretch without it. I used to think I knew where kindness would come from. I expected it from Jenny, if I'm honest. She quoted scripture the way other people quote weather reports, easily, constantly, as though she'd memorized the whole book. But I understand now that kindness was never going to come from knowing the passages. It comes from somewhere else entirely, somewhere memorization can't reach. And I expected it, in a smaller and sadder way, from Mandy, who I don't think was ever truly cruel. But kindness from her would have had to look like something harder than a disappearing text message on her way out the door. It would have had to look like standing in a room with Jenny and Allison while they were still deciding what kind of year I was going to have, and saying, out loud where they could hear her, that it wasn't fair. She never did that. I don't think she was built to. So I stopped expecting kindness to announce itself with words at all, and started noticing it instead in the absence of something, in a room where nobody bothers to be unkind simply because it wouldn't occur to them to try. I keep the brass elephant on my new desk, angled outward, facing the room. It's a small adjustment, moving a small object 6 inches so it faces the world instead of just me. But I notice it every morning. And some mornings I touch it before I sit down, the way you'd touch a doorframe on your way into a house you're still getting used to being allowed to live in. I think it's the truest measurement I have of what actually changed, and I think most days it's also a quiet promise to whoever I'll be a year from now that I'll notice sooner next time, that I won't wait for someone else's permission to believe what I already know. If you enjoyed this story, please like and subscribe.